Hi everyone, this is Dr. Karen's, and this is a different lecture over Chapter 14, the autonomic nervous system. The focus of this is on the neurotransmitters that are being used to talk to the target organs within the autonomic nervous system. This can be a little confusing, so I'll try to go slow, but listen carefully and refer to these images as I talk. So if you recall, the autonomic nervous system, one, it is talking to effectors that are involuntary, so smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. Also, it takes two motor neurons, for the most part, to talk to these effectors. The preganglionic neuron synapses with the postganglionic neuron, and that postganglionic neuron is talking to the effectors. Remember, anytime a neuron is trying to send a message to another cell, it has to use a neurotransmitter to do that. So not only are neurotransmitters getting used to send signals to the effector organs, but because we're dealing a lot with two motor neurons in a series, then we also are going to be using neurotransmitters in order for the preganglionic neuron to talk to the postganglionic neuron. So there are different areas where neurotransmitters are going to be used in the autonomic nervous system. The two neurotransmitters that the autonomic nervous system uses are norepinephrine or adrenaline and acetylcholine. In order to kind of make sense of where the different neurotransmitters are being used, it makes it easier to refer to the neurons that are releasing those specific neurotransmitters. So the neurons that are releasing acetylcholine are called cholinergic fibers here. The neurons that are releasing norepinephrine are called adrenergic fibers. Adrenergic for adrenaline, which is the other word for norepinephrine. So let's look at this a little more closely. If we're looking at the sympathetic division, in the first example here, there is a preganglionic neuron that releases acetylcholine onto the postganglionic neuron, and that postganglionic neuron releases norepinephrine. So in this situation, the preganglionic neuron is a cholinergic fiber because it releases acetylcholine, and the postganglionic neuron is an adrenergic fiber because it releases norepinephrine. Similarly, but not quite as similarly, if we look at the parasympathetic division, the preganglionic neuron releases acetylcholine, so that's a cholinergic fiber. In this case, the postganglionic neuron releases acetylcholine as well. So it's also a cholinergic neuron. If we go back to the sympathetic division, that one outlier where we're talking to the adrenal gland, there's only one neuron in question. The neuron releases acetylcholine onto the adrenal gland. So the neuron is a cholinergic neuron. The job of the adrenal gland is to release norepinephrine, and it gets released into the blood. So if we go back and look at the text up here, it says acetylcholine is released by cholinergic fibers at all autonomic nervous system preganglionic axons. What does that mean? It means all of the preganglionic neurons in the autonomic nervous system, whether or not you're talking about sympathetic or parasympathetic divisions, they all release acetylcholine, as you can see here, acetylcholine, acetylcholine, acetylcholine. So they are all preganglionic neurons, and they are all cholinergic neurons or cholinergic fibers because they all release acetylcholine. The other place within the autonomic nervous system where you find cholinergic fibers and therefore the release of acetylcholine is at the parasympathetic postganglionic axons. That is a mouthful, but what are we talking about? Go down here to the parasympathetic division. The postganglionic neuron also releases acetylcholine, so it's also a cholinergic fiber. Norepinephrine is released pretty much in one situation: sympathetic division, postganglionic axon or postganglionic neuron. The postganglionic neuron in the sympathetic division releases norepinephrine. The one exception to this is if the sympathetic division is talking to sweat glands, the postganglionic neuron releases acetylcholine, not norepinephrine. All right, so what are the effects on the target organs of norepinephrine and acetylcholine? It depends on which type of receptors you find on the target organs. So just like we have different types of neurons here based on which type of neurotransmitter they release, there are also different receptors on these target organs designed to bind to either norepinephrine or acetylcholine. There are cholinergic receptors that bind to acetylcholine. We see that in skeletal muscle because we know skeletal muscles in the somatic nervous system respond to acetylcholine. So those receptors are cholinergic receptors. But in the autonomic nervous system, because we have norepinephrine as well, there are receptors on target organs that will bind only to norepinephrine, and those are called adrenergic receptors. But of course, there are multiple categories under each of these types of receptors. Like I said, autonomic nervous system is complex. If we're looking at cholinergic receptors, these are the receptors that you find on target organs that will bind to acetylcholine. There are two types, nicotinic and muscarinic. Where do you find nicotinic cholinergic receptors? You find them on all postganglionic neurons. So, because in the autonomic nervous system, all of the preganglionic neurons release acetylcholine, that means the postganglionic neurons have to have acetylcholine receptors on them. And they do. They have cholinergic receptors, but more specifically, these cholinergic receptors are nicotinic receptors. The adrenal gland also is getting acetylcholine from its preganglionic neuron. So it must have cholinergic receptors on its surface, and it does, and specifically it has nicotinic cholinergic receptors. And then the last example is in the somatic nervous system, so not even in the autonomic nervous system. In skeletal muscles, we know they respond to acetylcholine. They have cholinergic receptors on their sarcolemma, and more specifically, they are nicotinic cholinergic receptors. If you are a nicotinic cholinergic receptor, not only do you bind to acetylcholine when it gets released to you, but the effect on you is stimulatory. We know skeletal muscles are always excited when they receive acetylcholine. That's because they have nicotinic cholinergic receptors on them. Everywhere else where we saw nicotinic cholinergic receptors, at the in the postganglionic neurons and at the adrenal gland, the effect of acetylcholine on those receptors is excitatory or stimulatory. And this makes sense. Let's just use one example here. Look at the sympathetic division. Preganglionic neuron releases acetylcholine onto the postganglionic neuron. The goal is to excite this neuron and cause an action potential so it can send its own neurotransmitter onto a target organ. So we want nicotinic cholinergic receptors on that postganglionic neuron. All right, but there are other types of cholinergic receptors. muscarinic cholinergic receptors. They also bind to acetylcholine. That's why they're called cholinergic receptors. Where do you find them? All effector cells that are stimulated by postganglionic cholinergic fibers. Ooh, what does that mean? Postganglionic fibers, that means the second neuron in the series. But in this case, we're only talking about postganglionic fibers that are also cholinergic, meaning that also release acetylcholine. So really the only example, at least in this image, is down here in the parasympathetic division. In this case, both the preganglionic and the postganglionic neurons release acetylcholine. So there are both cholinergic neurons. The postganglionic neuron is releasing acetylcholine onto a target organ. When this parasympathetic postganglionic neuron releases acetylcholine onto the target organ's cholinergic receptors that are going to be used are muscarinic receptors. And the effect on the target organ depends. It can be that acetylcholine can either excite that target organ or it can inhibit. It depends on the target organ. So again, just another level of complexity here in the autonomic nervous system. So those are the cholinergic receptors, meaning the receptors that are going to bind to acetylcholine. But we know that the autonomic nervous system also uses norepinephrine, right? Where are those receptors? So you need, if you have neurons that are releasing norepinephrine, then there's got to be cells somewhere with adrenergic receptors that can bind to that norepinephrine. The only place we really are seeing norepinephrine here is in the sympathetic division. The postganglionic neuron is an adrenergic fiber because it releases norepinephrine. So the same target organs that we were even talking about here at the parasympathetic division, not only do they have muscarinic cholinergic receptors, but they also have adrenergic receptors too. This is how a target organ will know whether it's getting a message from the sympathetic division or the parasympathetic division. Not only does it depend on which neurotransmitter is being released, but then also which receptor is binding to that neurotransmitter. Very complicated. There are two types of adrenergic receptors that will respond to norepinephrine: alpha receptors and beta receptors. And whether or not that norepinephrine excites or inhibits the target organs that have these receptors, again, depends on how many of each type of receptor is on the target organ. So if the example they say here, norepinephrine binds to cardiac muscle beta 1 receptors. That causes an increase in cardiac muscle rate. So that's excitatory. But epinephrine does the opposite. It inhibits bronchial or it inhibits respiration in the lungs. That's what bronchial relaxation means, because it binds to B2 receptors in the heart. So again, depending on, not in the heart, in the lungs. So depending on which of these types of receptors predominates on the target organ, that will dictate the effect of norepinephrine on the target organ. These details you do not have to know for the test. That is really, really complex. However, here is a summary, table 14.3, a summary of those types of receptors. So if the neurotransmitter is acetylcholine, the receptor type is cholinergic, but there are two types, nicotinic and muscarinic. It tells you where you find those specific types of cholinergic receptors, and then it tells you what is the effect of acetylcholine when it binds to each of those types of receptors. The same for epinephrine or norepinephrine. These are the types of adrenergic receptors. This is where you find those types of adrenergic receptors, and this is the effect when norepinephrine binds to those types of receptors. You do not have to know this table by heart. Really, I'm just illustrating how complex this is. What you should understand are these terms cholinergic and adrenergic. So cholinergic fibers release acetylcholine. Cholinergic receptors bind to acetylcholine. Adrenergic fibers release norepinephrine. Adrenergic receptors bind to norepinephrine. The effects are variable. Again, adding to this complexity of the autonomic nervous system.